Hello everyone, welcome to PM5s. I am Dr. Vishwjeet Kawar. In last few lectures, we have seen the Stone Age, Chalcolithic Age and Indus Valley civilization. In today's lecture, we will cover some basic concept relating to this period, time period or different ages or culture. So from this prehistory to historic period. So before we start this period, different ages or different culture, we will understand what is meant by this prehistory and history. So before invention of writing or before the written records are available, we consider this as prehistory. So before the 600 BCE in northern part of India, we call this as a prehistory. So this is prehistory. Once these written records are available, we call this as a historical period or history. So here we have this written records. Here we don't have the written records. So basically, to reconstruct the history of this period or to understand the history of this period, we are dependent on archaeological sources. To reconstruct the history of prehistoric period. Similarly, for this historic period, we have this written records, means this historic period means after the invention of writing. Along with these written records, we also have this archaeological evidences. So based on this invention of writing, we have divided this entire period to prehistoric and historic. So during this prehistoric period, we don't have these written records available. During this historic period, we have these written records available. If you consider northern part of India, like Gangetic Plain, this history or historic period starts around 600 BC or we can consider 6th century BC. 6th century BC. But some scholars consider this division as prehistory, protohistory and history. Now we will see what is meant by this protohistory. Until now we have divided in two parts, prehistory and historic period. In the historic period, we have these written records available. In this prehistory, we are dependent on these archaeological sources. Why? Written records are not available. But if you consider the Indus Valley civilization or Vedic period. So what is this timeline of Indus Valley civilization? From 2600 to 1900 BC. What is the time period of this Vedic period? 1500 to 500 BC. So if you consider this both Indus Valley civilization and Vedic period, both should come in this prehistory if you consider this timeline. But for this historical period, we are dependent on written records. For this prehistory, we don't have any written records and we are dependent on this archaeological sources. If you consider this Indus Valley civilization, we have this script. So what is this condition here? We must have this written records. So according to this definition, this should not come under this historic period. So even though we have this script, we could not decipher it. So the historians, some scholars consider this as a protohistory, means written records are available but we could not decipher. So correct definition of this historical period is written records are available plus they are deciphered, means we should use these written records to understand the historical period of that history of that period. Similarly, for this Vedic period, if you consider this timeline 1500 to 500 BC, we are dependent on these Vedas like Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Samveda and Atharvaveda. So we are dependent on Vedas. Vedas are written records. So you must consider that this period should be in the historic period. But these Vedas were not written during this period. These are written much later. So if you consider this generally in the prehistory, we are dependent on these archaeological sources. But for this reconstruction of this Vedic period, we are dependent on these written records. So from this period, 3000 to 600 BC, we consider this as a proto-history. So before this proto-history, we have this prehistory. In prehistory, we don't have any written records available, and the reconstruction is based on archaeological sources. If you consider this historical period, we have this written records, and for this reconstruction, we are dependent on this written records. But in this proto-history, in first case, we have these written records, but we could not decipher. That's why we should not be dependent on this script. Or in the second period, we have these written records, but these were not written during this period. So basically, you can consider this prehistory as a before 600 BC. And this prehistory means before 600 BC, it is again divided into Stone Age and Metal Age. Means based on the material used, this prehistory is again divided into first is Stone Age and then is Metal Age. This Metal Age is again divided into Copper Age, means Chalcolithic period, Bronze Age and Iron Age. Now we will consider this one by one. So this is prehistoric to historic period. So this transition is 600 BC. So around this 600 BC, we have this beginning of historic period. And before this 600 BC, we have this prehistory. We have this prehistory. It is again divided into Stone Age and then Metal Age. This Metal Age is again divided into Chalcolithic, means people were using copper. Then Bronze Age, people were using bronze, and then Iron Age, people were using iron. Now we will see one by one. So if we start this Stone Age, it is again divided into three main types: Paleolithic period, then Mesolithic period, and then Neolithic period. So based on the type of stone tools they were using, it is classified into Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic. So basically during this Paleolithic period, they were using large stones. Large and crude, means the stone were not specialized. Once you go from this Paleolithic to Mesolithic, Mesolithic to Neolithic, Neolithic to Chalcolithic, during this period there was advancement of technology. So even from this Paleolithic to Mesolithic, there were advancement of technology, and now this Mesolithic period, people were using microlith. Microlith means small stone tools whose size is less than 5 centimeter. If you go beyond this Mesolithic period, means Neolithic period, people were using polished stone tools. People were using polished stone tools. So during this Paleolithic period, people were using large and crude stone tools, basically hand axe, cleavers and choppers. During this Mesolithic period, people were using microlith or small stone tools. In the Neolithic period, people were using these polished stone tools. But remember this fact, this development is not uniform. Means you may consider once this Paleolithic ends, Mesolithic starts. Once this Mesolithic ends, Neolithic starts. Once this Neolithic ends, Chalcolithic starts. No, this is not like that. There is a overlapping. Why there is overlapping? Because it basically depends on what type of stone tools they were using. Suppose during this Mesolithic period, means Mesolithic period span from 10,000 BC to 4,000 BC. This Paleolithic in India starts from 6 lakh years ago to 10,000 BC. Mesolithic from 10,000 to 4,000. Neolithic from 7,000 to 1,000. So if you consider this Mesolithic from 10,000 to 4,000 BC, in certain part of India, people were using this microlith. People were using this microlith. That's why these sites were Mesolithic sites. And people were not using these polished stone tools. So these sites were Mesolithic. Suppose during this period, around this time, in some part of India, people started using these polished stone tools. So these sites we considered as a Neolithic sites. Means at a given period of time, in some part of India, people were still using microlith and they were not using polished stone tools. So these sites were Mesolithic site. In another part, people were started using polished stone tools. So these sites were Neolithic. Means once this Mesolithic ends, Neolithic start. This concept is wrong. There is a overlap because it basically depends on what type of stone tools they were using. Similarly, if you consider this Chalcolithic, during this Chalcolithic period, people started using copper. During this Chalcolithic period, people started using copper. But this Chalcolithic period is span from 4000 BC to 700 BC. During this same period, when some people were using copper, there were another people, means in another part of India, they were still dependent on these polished stone tools. they were still not using this copper. So some sites were in the Neolithic period and other sites were in this Chalcolithic period. So this development is not uniform or unilinear. In different parts of India, suppose in another part people still dependent on this microlith, so they will be in this microlith, means Mesolithic period. If in another part people were using this polystone tools, so they will be in this Neolithic period. In another part people were using this copper, so they will be in this Chalcolithic period. During this Chalcolithic period, means from 4000 to 700 BC, particularly from 2600 to 1900 BC, in the northwestern part of Indian subcontinent, people started using bronze. And we call this as a Bronze Age. This Indus Valley civilization is basically a Bronze Age. Then from 1500 to 500, we know this is a Vedic period, and around this 1000 BC, people started using this iron, means common people were extensively using this iron, and we call this as a beginning of Iron Age. So now you understand this Paleolithic period starts from 6 lakh to 10,000 BC, Mesolithic starts from 10,000 to 4,000 BC, Neolithic from 7,000 to 1,000 BC, Chalcolithic, during which people were using coppers, from 4,000 to 700 BC, and Iron Age after this 1000 BC. This is a superficial view. Now we will consider some in-depth analysis. If you consider in India, this Paleolithic period, it starts around 6 lakh BCE, means 6 lakh years ago. Why we consider this start as a 6 lakh years ago? Based on the archaeological evidences. Suppose if tomorrow we find some evidences from the archaeological evidences, if it is clear that people started using these stone tools around 1.3 million year ago, then we can definitely consider the start of Paleolithic as a 1.3 million year ago. Some research is going on based on the artifacts found in the Bori in Maharashtra. We have found this artifact, and according to this radiocarbon dating, some consider this as a 1.3 million year ago. Then we might consider this Paleolithic starts from the 1.3 million. But now you understand, for now just consider this as a 6 lakh to 10,000 BC. This is a Paleolithic period. Now if you consider this Mesolithic period, it spans from 10,000 BC to 4,000 BC. Remember, this is a general timeline or general period, means it is applicable for most number of sites or almost all sites, but not for all sites. Almost all means there are going to be some exception, because research is still going on. Based on the archaeological evidences, these timelines are still changing. If you consider this Lenganaj in Gujarat, this Lenganaj, it is from 2500 to 2000 BC, and it is still in this Mesolithic phase. Means people of this period were using this microlith but not the polished stone tool. So in general we consider this Mesolithic from 10,000 to 4,000, but we have found this Lenganaj from 2500 to 2000. Means basically these are the just average, or we consider this now as a period or timeline for this phase, but it may change in the future based on the archaeological evidences. So basically this Paleolithic and Mesolithic people were hunter gatherers, and Neolithic people were first farmers in India. It starts around 7000 BC. Remember this Chalcolithic phase. During this Chalcolithic phase, people were using copper. So copper was the first metal used by human all over world, also in the India. If you consider this Chalcolithic phase starts around 4000 BC, does it mean people first time used the copper during this 4000 BC? No. People were using this copper before also, but when we found some copper object, that doesn't mean copper starts around that period. No. This is the beginning of copper technology. But once common people were using this copper in daily life, then we consider this as a Chalcolithic phase. If you consider this Neolithic phase from 7000 BC, there is one site Mehergarh, currently in the Balochistan, Pakistan. We have found during this Neolithic phase, we have found some coppers, but that doesn't mean the site was Chalcolithic at that period. No. If you find some copper, that means they knew this technology of copper making. Means we can consider this as a beginning of copper technology, but not the beginning of copper age. We consider the period as a copper age once common people were using in this daily life. So this is basic understanding of prehistory and historical period. So it starts with the Stone Age, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, then Chalcolithic, then Iron Age. But remember, if you consider for every site they have to follow this sequence, no. Suppose some sites were using microlith in the initial phase, means from 10,000 to 4,000, and it's quite possible that instead of using polished stone tools, they were also using this copper along with polished stone tools. So they will jump from Mesolithic period to Chalcolithic. So if you consider some sites in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, specifically northern part of Maharashtra, we found these Neolithic sites along with this Chalcolithic. Means after this Mesolithic period, there is direct jump to this Chalcolithic period. So in general, in Indian subcontinent, we consider the first farmer as from Neolithic period, but basically from Maharashtra or Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan, the first farmers were from this Chalcolithic age. So you must understand these developments or from one phase to another phase, this is not a linear fashion. There must be some overlap. Overlap is because we have divided based on the type of stone tools or in general type of material they were using. So I hope through this small lecture you must know, you have understood about this transition from prehistory to historic period. In next lecture we will come with the another topic.